is of the utmost urgency that we discuss the foreskin of Jesus Christ. Hello, and welcome to the Notes App Archive, a section that I'll be developing here on Substack where I'll talk about things that should definitely remain on my Notes app and that I should ponder over privately, but I've decided to share here instead. It's the first episode of this series, and I decided we should tackle something that is appropriately weird and something that I'm properly obsessed with, aka the Holy Prepuce, the Jesus Christ's foreskin, if you will. I'm just so excited to talk about this. I feel like I'm in awe, truly, of all the ways in which the man has found a connection to its penis to the point where it justifies essentially the creation of the world. It's truly fascinating to me, and it's something that permeates several aspects of life regarding the sociopolitical, cultural, and religious landscape. I'm excited! It's been a few days after I recorded that first clip and it's been raining. Hopefully you don't hear any of it, but if you do, just enjoy the very sweet ambient sounds as we engage in conversations surrounding the importance of circumcision. Circumcision had its very beginnings particularly in Southwest Asian and Egyptian societies that were utilizing it as a landmark, specifically surrounding the aspect of having it be a societal status symbol. Say, uncircumcised men would be unable to perform certain tasks or roles within their society because of their uncircumcised state, whereas circumcised men would be able to perform this because they carried that type of privilege within their position in the hierarchy of the system that was set up for them to thrive. So they had to acknowledge that importance and the value they brought into the community by executing those roles. This was something that was replicated and passed on from generation to generation until it got to Christians and Jewish people. Christians dropped it around the 2nd century CE, which we'll talk about later, but just know that they dropped it for now. However, as we know, Jewish people decided to preserve it even to this day as an official religious ritual of theirs. But why is it so important for Jewish people to be circumcised in the first place, and what does that imply in terms of, having them acknowledge the corporality of God? Does it mean that maybe at some point he had a body with a penis? Does it mean that that penis was circumcised? And the answer to all those questions would be yes. According to what Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou goes on to answer in her own book, God and Anatomy, she essentially argues for the corporality of God and how it was also revered in ancient communities. And it's just a very distant perception from what we have now, which is kind of this omniscient God that is also able to control the forces of the universe. But as a collective, we've decided that he has no appearance, and in having him being assigned an appearance, we would limit him as an entity. It's kind of accepted that among ancient communities, they indeed had a god whose name was El. He was sort of the predecessor to the contemporary god we know today. And El had a body, and he was a god who had very human passions, very human feelings, and at some point he was even very sexual. His sexuality was especially remarked throughout the narrative tool of his wife, Ashita. So Ashita and him essentially were portrayed to be the co-creators of the universe. The story goes that they copulated at some point, and as Ashita is opening her leg, she creates an opening in which God ejaculates, and he essentially creates the universe because of his seminal discharge. However, it's implied in this story that the one who holds the universe together is Ashita with her legs. This wasn't very self-serving in terms of what the patriarchy wanted, so they started to kind of slowly raise Ashita from all the retellings of the Bible until it got to the point where the story that I'm about to tell you replaced it. And now we have an arguably more sanitized version of that story. But the story goes that God was the one who masturbated all on his own, and his seminal discharge was the one who helped him, create the universe, but he needed no one else's help. So what does circumcision have to do with it? Well, previously circumcision used to be believed as something that would it help you increase your fertile potency. So this is why a lot of people would engage with it, because that will help you be fruitful and multiply the way God intended. So God intended for you to have like a bunch of children and for you to be very masculine and to show your virility. So this was something that God definitely wanted, and that's because he himself was circumcised. Otherwise, how would he be able to create the universe? If he wasn't circumcised, even if he's a god, how did he achieve that type of fertile potency? This is something that requires a lot of energy and power and being potent and having lots and lots of fertility. So this was kind of the logic behind circumcision and as to why people started to kind of replicate it. Aside from that, another motive as to why people would get circumcised was the fact that there was a fear instilled in the public. So people started to be like, hey, if you don't circumcise your baby, you will have him doomed for life, and he'll also have to suffer from an unavoidable death that will come in the form of a sacrifice. And people were like, what? And so they started to replicate circumcision as a way of avoiding having a gruesome destiny for them as well as for their babies. So, as I said, God had very human feelings and very human passions, and his characteristics were very much the one of a selfish and greedy man who would ask for the share of the crops of people as well as animals. So people would sacrifice animals and they would leave them at the temples as offerings. However, people wanted something that was more straightforward in connection to God. So they started to say that God was the one who asked for people to have some form of sacrifice regarding humans as well. Obviously, people were not going to kill their own babies, so they were like, well, what's a way in which we could negotiate this? So they were like, foreskin will have to do. So they started to offer their foreskins, or well, the baby's foreskins at the temples as offerings in order for them to avoid that sacrificial death for the baby, which is really interesting because beforehand, people used to apply the ceremony of circumcision to babies and boys. However, circumcision started to be applied to boys, baby boys, in the hopes of them not being doomed to a gruesome destiny. That's how it started to be applied as a ceremony that would be enforced right after the birth of a baby, particularly on the 8th day after the child was born. Specifically because in the verse Luke 2:21, we can see that Jesus Christ was circumcised on the 8th day in order for God to kind of make his claim to Jesus not only as his son, but also as a person that would have his body claimed by God. So this is what circumcision represented as well. God wanted a cut of humans, animals, and crops, and that's what he got. Another interesting form of regulation, which is just insane, and something that I guess I never thought about because it's you typically hear about regulations regarding women's bodies, but you never get to hear a lot of men's bodies being regulated. And this is a way in which they were regulated, particularly surrounding the ways in which they would use their penis and specifically their seminal discharge. Back in the day, semen was perceived to be a very miraculous substance that was life-giving. However, if used improperly, you had the potential of wasting it, as you were actively avoiding trying to reproduce and be fruitful and multiply the way God intended with your wife. So I'm about to read to you some aspects of a list that I've compiled about the ways in which you could waste your semen, and I'm going to break some of them down. So the first element in ways to waste your semen among ancient societies is cheat on your wife with thy neighbor's wife. Having sex outside of marriage, as we know, was looked down upon. So this was some way in order for you to kind of waste your semen because you were actively avoiding your wife and actively avoiding reproducing with her. The next one is have sex with foreign women. Foreign women had the capacity of adoring other gods, hence negating the exclusivity of God's claim to the baby's bodies that you would have with these women. So that's how a sense of xenophobia was promoted, I guess, in order for them to kind of preserve this religion and this form of ritual. The third one is have sex with your wife while on her period. So back in the day, period used to be regarded as a toxic substance that would essentially curse you and your wife if you were ever to be engaging in intercourse throughout that stage. And so in order for you to kind of get rid of that curse, you would have to wait a little while, wait some days until you could go to religious ceremonies again. And your wife had to wait even more. That could be from 30 to 44 days or even more if you kept on doing the deed. Then we have penetrative sex with animals and penetrative sex with men. Of course, there is an implied sense of homophobia in this, but it's not the contemporary homophobia. It's more so in the fact that there's a mix of dangerous substances. So there's the mix of semen with fecal matter. So this was regarded as something that was automatically toxic and you were essentially doomed for life. You were not complying with God's command because you would have the very dangerous mix of substances being created within your body. And the next one is ejaculating on the earth. This was a narrative that was pushed in order for the men to be avoidant of masturbation, as it was regarded as something that would go against God's command of being fruitful and multiply. I guess this is something that I wanted to talk about first in order for us to understand why circumcision in the first place is so important and why is it that the foreskin of Jesus Christ is adjudicated as something that is so regarded as something so relevant and sacred, aside from it belonging to Jesus Christ, because it implies a certain aspect to Jesus Christ that we no longer see, which is him maybe being very sexual and very very masculine. I feel like oftentimes we get to interpret Jesus Christ as someone who's never fucked, essentially. While this doesn't necessarily prove that he had an actual sexual life, that still proves that a lot of people were projecting their sexual desires upon the teachings of the Bible and specifically on the figure of Jesus Christ, which we'll talk about later. Currently, there aren't a lot of resources that could help us determine what Jesus Christ actually looked like. However, there are some instances in the Bible that could be described as very detailed accounts of the way his humanity manifested, particularly surrounding the sacrificial nature of his very existence. These aspects are the ones of the descriptions of the wounds that he would go on to receive throughout his life. So we have the wounds that he received while being hanged on the cross, but also we have the very first wound that he would receive as a consequence of his circumcision. And this is very important because it would essentially not only attest to his humanity, but also foreshadow the rest of things that were expecting to happen to him as the Messiah that he was, again, in terms of his sacrificial nature. This was also very important because it didn't only connect him in a holy way to God, but it also connected him symbolically to his brothers in Christ, aka the disciples who also happened to be circumcised. Isn't that so romantic? It's like blood packs, but instead of blood packs, it's just circumcisions for everyone. How sweet. Circumcision was especially useful in order for them to kind of brand Jesus Christ as this so devout and so a faithful and loyal Jewish man who also happened to follow the more customary traditions of the Jewish religion pretty much since he was a baby. So in terms of branding, this was genius because it also prevented people from shifting the narrative to maybe have him become something else in the future, like maybe exclusively Muslim or exclusively Catholic or something like that. So people started to have him being branded as Jewish precisely because of the circumcision. In spite of this would go on to become something that was a source of resentment, particularly around the 2nd century CE in the Greco-Roman empires, where circumcision was starting to be perceived as something that was a cruel act of mutilation, as well as an act of castration, and something that would have men become very effeminate, and also something that would be considered an act of sexual abuse that little children would have to endure. Obviously, the reputation of circumcision around this time wasn't the best, and because of it, people started to get to the point of wanting to reverse their circumcisions. There were two main ways, but I'm not going to even mention them. Just know that it didn't work. Anyway, the increasing perception of discriminatory practices against people who were circumcised prompted the government to eventually outlaw circumcision as a whole, as it was heavily related to acts of castration. It wasn't until the 4th century CE that people started to get actually interested in the whereabouts of the foreskin. I mean, somebody cut it, so where is it? And so people started to believe that because it was related to a saint and consequently to God, it had some form of magical power. So people were in general looking for the remains of Jesus Christ, but particularly the foreskin, as that was the thing that was most likely to be able to survive. The people yearned for the holy Prepuce. Particularly in the 5th century CE, this is where we get to see kind of the quest be enhanced and prompted by certain authorities, specifically people belonging to the church and Christian mystics. So we get to see this because of the Arabic infancy gospel. This is a gospel that essentially contained a bunch of stories from the way Jesus Christ lived during his childhood. And there's a story containing a woman who's a midwife who was present at the birth of Jesus Christ as well as his circumcision. So once he was circumcised, this woman for some reason decides to take the prepuce with her. She puts it on a jar filled with oil and gives it to her son, who's a pharmacist, and she goes, "Hey, maybe don't sell this because this is the holy prepuce and I want it." And her son disobeys and ends up selling it. And the reason we know this is because while Jesus would grow up to be an adult, there's this story where he gets his feet kissed and anointed with the same oil that was containing the holy prepuce in the jar. This happened because of someone who's described in the story as a sinful woman who's maybe believed to be Mary Magdalene. So this is kind of something that's giving hope to people like, oh, well, if there's this story, then that means that the prepuce is somewhere and we could go look for it now. Like it's in someone's jar, we just go look for it. Ever since then, people started to claim that they were in possession of the holy prepuce. So it was people like churches, bishops, mystics, pilgrims, you name it. They were in possession of the holy foreskin. Actually, one of the more famous foreskins was located in Rome. It belonged to the first Holy Roman Emperor, and he essentially said that a heavenly hand appeared and handed him the prepuce. And for some reason, he took it on a world tour. He took it to Germany, he took it to France, and finally he took it to Rome, where he would give it away to Pope Leo III. So Leo was very much known to keep the remains of other bodily fluids as well as bodily organs of Jesus Christ. He kept the umbilical cord of Jesus Christ, he kept his dead blood, and now he got to keep the foreskin. We don't have confirmation if these were actually belonging to Jesus Christ at some point, but he believed it. He must have been so happy. I know I would. It wasn't until 1527 that the holy prepuce got lost. And it got lost because of the wars that were going on with Pope Clement VII, as well as the Holy Roman Emperor of the time, Charles V. Rome got ransacked, and that's when, between all the confusion and tumultuous interactions, the foreskin just got lost. It was last seen in 1983 in the town of Calcutta, Italy. So moments before the ritual exhibition of its annual festival, because the foreskin has an annual festival where they must display the holiness of it, I guess. The priest that had it, who for some reason you would think because it's so sacred, he would keep it somewhere that, people could actually see it. But for some reason, he just had it in a closet. The closet of his house. And he said, "Sorry guys, my closet got ransacked, my house is ransacked, and maybe it was a thief." But some people just believe that it was stolen by dark forces from the Vatican, who were very much discouraging this whole aspect of the holy foreskin. They were like, please guys, we don't need to know about the dick of Jesus Christ. Let's just all rejoice over the spirituality that he has and that fills our hearts. But people were stubborn, so they wanted to venerate a holy foreskin. People were yearning for the holy prepuce. What's so difficult to get? There was a lack of concern when it came to actually determining whether or not people were in the presence of the Holy Prepuce, as there were multiple reports that people started to be in the presence of the Holy Prepuce in multiple parts of the world, as well as multiple churches. This definitely caused for some people to feel comforted by it because they said, well, if it's so holy, it must have the capacity to be fruitful and reproduce and regenerate the way God intended. So they were not thinking it as a lie that was crafted by multiple people. Rather, they were like, well, that's what's supposed to happen. We are meant to see it in different parts of the world for the worshippers to kind of witness the greatness of the holiness of the Prepuce. The presence of the foreskins throughout the world essentially replicated what the consumption of the Eucharist was trying to achieve. However, back in the day, there were indeed some people who were curious and were trying to test out whether or not they were holding a legitimate holy prepuce. Most of the time, these got certified by multiple Christian mystics who also happen to have a connection with the divine through mostly visions. These visions would be the ones to confirm the accuracy of the holiness of the relic that they were holding in their hands. But if that isn't enough for you, don't worry. They could always have a physician that would be hired to take a nibble at the matter and sort of confirm if it was animal leather, vegetal matter, or an actual foreskin. Multiple people declared that they were supposed to have a sweet scent and a sweet flavor. This was a claim made by several people, and among them a saint and a Christian mystic. Her name was Agnes Blanbeking. I don't know if I read that right, but I hope I mispronounced it because she is not touching those pearly gates. She's freaky as hell. She would consistently say that she would have all these visions of her having a taste of the prepuce. Like the prepuce would manifest miraculously as she was taking her communion. So it would manifest in her mouth immediately. And she has this story where she tells that she once tried to touch it, and as soon as she tried, the foreskin went down her throat, and so she would simply swallow like a bunch of foreskins, according to her, that were holy. And she definitely had this perception that the holy foreskin was very sweet. She was definitely one peculiar mystic, as she constantly had very erotic visions regarding God and Jesus Christ, specifically on the annual feast of circumcision. So she would go on to describe the texture as the one of an egg, and also it was very sweet, having the capacity for it to provide kind of like an out-of-body experience that was orgasmic. But she isn't the only woman who would eroticize Jesus Christ. There was another story with sort of a similar undertone that was highlighted with Catherine of Siena as the protagonist. She would claim she was living her life in holy matrimony to Jesus Christ, and so she was like Agnes, a devotee and a nun who would claim in the 14th century that she had a vision where Jesus' foreskin was wrapped around her finger like a wedding band, and because of it, she was convinced that she was living her life being engaged to Jesus Christ. These women are insane. I don't know where they are, but I know it's not talking to St. Peter in those pearly gates. So we finally arrive at the part where we conceive, against our will by the way, that these ideas that were regarding the eroticism of Jesus Christ were essentially for them to feel closer to God through his physicality, rather than the theological practices that the churches were providing for people. And it's definitely very disturbing to see, because you are always kind of assuming that Jesus Christ has this asexual, childless appearance, and it's not all that true when it comes to the perception that people in Asian communities had, and it's awful. Anyway, now that these freaky stories have ended, I decided why not incorporate more freaky stories. So I've decided to discuss with you all the impact in terms of the socio-political, cultural, and religious landscape that the circumcision of Jesus Christ had in medieval Western art. Enjoy! In Western art, particularly medieval art, circumcision was heavily associated still to castration. So it's essentially the same rhetoric that we saw and the continuation of anti Semitic speech coming from the 2nd century in the Greco Roman Empire. Typically, the controversial depiction would essentially include a very scared baby Jesus that was trying to be enforced into circumcision by a man who was deliberately being portrayed as a woman, and he was feminized in order for people to convey the emasculation of the act that they were partaking in. One popular portrayal of this scene is the one from the Pilgrimage trilogy circa 1400, where a man who's depicted as a woman gets close to Jesus with a huge pair of scissors as Joseph and Mary stand by with a concerned expression on their faces. Specifically, we get to see the expression of the Virgin Mary that lets us know that this has been a wound made to a child against their parents' consent. This type of connection between Mary and baby Jesus will prove to be a constant in their portrayal in medieval art. In some paintings, Mary covers the genitals of the baby with her hand. In some others, she showcases the penis proudly, as this is the connection Jesus has to the human world. So naturally, it didn't take too long till people started to take this rhetoric surrounding the narrative between baby Jesus and Mother Mary in order for them to be kind of sexualized in an incestuous context. One particular painting attributed to William Key highlights an adult Christ being held by Mary as they kiss on the lips. He is noticeably covered in his genitals, yet an erection can be appreciated in the painting, symbolizing his return in human form as part of his resurrection, and not only that, but a resurrection that's reliant on his masculinity for it to be accomplished, as it's the virility that is so life-giving that will ensure the miracle happens. It's very weird because we are essentially witnessing something that we were not habituated to in terms of us getting a constant sanitized version of Jesus Christ. And it's so interesting because to me, the fact that even the Vatican is unable to properly acknowledge the physicality to God, maybe not with his foreskin, but maybe with other remains, it definitely further enhances the dehumanization, especially concerning the social aspects to the life of Jesus Christ. I also think that it's so interesting because he definitely worked as a catalyst for multiple societies in order for them to set up the patriarchal standards that were working as a guide in order for us to properly establish some aspects to him that were very controversial and also very contrasting, specifically regarding his divine masculinity. I couldn't imagine the way phallocentrism has permeated society in such a way that it's almost toxic, honestly, the way we live our lives around penis. And well, this is all I had to say for now. I think this is a properly insane first episode to go off of, and I just wanted to talk about it. I had no one to talk to, and this was just a great experiment. This is my very first video, and I learned to edit because of this shit. So hopefully you appreciate it, and if you're interested in having me talk about other topics, let me know. I don't know how you can let me know. I don't know the way Substack works. And I'll see you when I upload next. Thank you for watching. Bye!